Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. My name is Edwin Hernandez, Grasshopper Specialist at ShapeDiver. In today's video, we will explore one of our most popular topics, which is JSON Objects. So if you need to manage big amounts of data or complex parameter structures, today's topic will teach you how to do so in the most efficient way. But first, before we get started, please remember to subscribe and to like this video as it really helps our channel. And if you want to know more about what you can do with ShapeDiver, don't forget to visit our website. Let's get started. First of all, we need to make a quick introduction about what JSON objects are. So a JSON object means a JavaScript object notation, which is a lightweight data interchange format, and it is easy for humans to read and write. A JSON object is a format that is completely independent of any language, so that means that anybody using different programming languages such as C++, C, C#, JavaScript, etc. can use them and work with them. In our case, what is more relevant is JavaScript, as we will use this information in online configurators which use JavaScript. That means that JSON objects are universal data structures and that virtually all modern programming languages support them in one form or another. The main structures or forms that a JSON needs are objects, which are an unordered set of name-value pairs, and they are identified because they start with a left brace and end with a right brace. The name is followed by a colon, and then after the colon you have the value. This value can be all kinds of data types, including an array, and an array is the second form that a JSON can support. This form, contrary to the objects, is an ordered collection of values, and it identifies because it starts with a left brace and ends with a right brace. So in one hand, an object contains name and values, and on the other hand, an array contains just a list, a collection of values. So for us, for Grasshopper developers, how is this relevant? So let's go now to Rhino and to Grasshopper. And here we have already one JSON object, a very simple one. So we can identify again that it is a JSON object because it starts with a brace and ends with a brace, and then we have the pair of names and values. So for example, we have the first name, which is company, and the value is ShapeDiver. The next one will be city, and the value is Vienna, and the next one will be team member, and the value is Edwin. And the way we can access this in Grasshopper is by using some components that we offer in our ShapeDiver Grasshopper plugin. So if we go to our plugin, we have the section called JSON, and inside this we have different components that you can use to work with JSON objects. So let's start by using the parse component. This component will convert any text into an actual JSON object. So right now what we have here is a panel, just a simple panel, a Grasshopper panel, and this panel just generates text. So it is not really seen by our computer as a JSON object, but just as text. So first of all, we have to parse it. We have to convert our string, our text, into an object. So we just connect our text into our input, which is the JSON input, and the output will give us actually the object that then we can access via our other components. So if we go back to our JSON components, we have the next one, that is the ShapeDiver JSON access. And with this one, we will be able to access information inside our JSON. So if we connect our object inside our object input, and then we add an address, then we will be able to access information. An address is basically the place where the data that we need lives. So in this case, for example, let's say that I want to know the company. So I just create a panel which says company, and I input this into my address. And this will give us as result ShapeDiver, which is what we have inside our JSON object. Then we can continue with the next one, that is city, and then we get Vienna, and team member will give us Edwin. So basically the address is simply the property where our data lives, where our value lives. Now this is a very simple JSON object, but we can make JSON objects as complex as we want. So let's look at another more complex example. This example contains the same company, city, but now team members is an array. So how do we know that there is an array? Because we have some brackets here and here. So our attribute team members is actually a collection of values which contains, in this case, 3 items, 3 names, in this case Matthew, Edwin and Ezekiel. And the same happened with country. So in country we also have an array, and we also have 3 values in this case that are countries. So France, Colombia and Mexico. So now we need to access this information in Grasshopper. So how do we do that? So as we saw, first of all, we need to parse it. So we need to convert this from text to actually an object. So we connect our text into our JSON input, and then we get an object as output. Then we access our information, and the address here again could be just as simple as company, and then we get ShapeDiver as result. But then what happens when the attribute gives us a collection of values? So if we put team members, we get as a result a list in Grasshopper. So now we have a list of 3 items which are the team members' names. So if we know that, for example, we want the attribute team members, but then I want just the item in the index number 2, for example. So I would go team members, and then I will open a bracket, and then I will add the index that I need. So in this case will be 2. So that means that I'm accessing a list of values. Then I close my bracket, I go OK, and then that will give me directly the result in team members in the index number 2. The same happens with country. So if I go and copy another of these access components, and then I create a different address. So for example, I want to know the country of this index number 2. So I just add country, and as a result, I will get just the country in the index number 2. So far in these examples, we have worked just with text. So for example, if you want to import a database as a JSON format, then you can access this. You can access, for example, information of users, information of product descriptions, prices, etc. And then you could use Grasshopper to process this information and put it, for example, into a quote. So as you know, we now support exporting PDFs, for example, or even parametric images. So you could use this JSON information to create a PDF which contains the customer name or products descriptions and prices. But let's say that we want to use a JSON to actually create geometry. So let's start from scratch, a new object. So as you know, an object has to start with a brace and end with a brace. So there we have an object, and then we can create some attributes. So for example, we want to create just a point, just a simple point. So we can add the attribute x, my x coordinate, and give it a value 100, for example. Then we go to the next one, the y attribute, the y coordinates, and then we add another number, and then finally the z one, and then we add another number. So this is a very simple JSON, just with 3 attributes, x, y, and z, which give us values, which in this case are numbers. So we parse our object, and then we want to access each attribute. So for example, I could start saying x, and then I have my x coordinate, then I can access my y coordinate, and finally I can access my z coordinate, and then simply I construct a point, and now we have created a point in our Rhino viewer. But there is another way that we can create this point, which is through an array. So for example, here we create an object, but we could also create an array, so a list of values. In this case, our object will start with a name, so for example, point, and this point contains an array, a list. And this list is again some numbers, so it will be the x coordinate, the y coordinate, and finally the z coordinate. And then we parse this object and we access the attribute point. That will give us as result a list of numbers. And then we can use again the same methodology here of picking each item, but in this case we're going to use a different component that we also have in our JSON components, which is the ShapeDiver JSON convert component. This component takes data that comes from a JSON and convert it into Grasshopper data. So in this case, when you give it 3 numbers, then it identifies that this is a point, and then it gives us as a result just a point with the given coordinates. This component can also convert more complex JSON structures, but we will see that later in this video. Let's have a look now at an object, a JSON object that will allow us to create a curve. So in this case, this object starts with the attribute points, which is an array, so a list. But this list is a list of objects, which have again attributes and values. So we have in this case 1, 2, 3, and 4 objects. And each of these objects contain the same attributes, which in this case would be our coordinates. So that means that with this JSON object, we are describing 4 points in our viewer. So we have to do the same that we've done so far. We have to parse our object first, and then we're going to access the information of this object. In this case, we're going to access points. And as an output, we will get a list of smaller JSON objects, in this case, which contains all the same X and Z attribute. So if we go deeper inside this JSON, we could access, for example, all the X coordinates in each of these 4 JSONs. And the other one that we have here is the Z one. So in this way, we get a list of 4 numbers for the X coordinate and a list of 4 numbers for the Z coordinate. All of them are in this case divided into branches so that we know the source of our data. So now if we create a construct point component, if we check this in 3D, we will be able to check all the different points in our viewer. And if we then create a curve based out of these points, then we're going to start creating more complex geometry based on a JSON structure. So with this, we can continue and go even deeper, even more complex, and create several of these curves with the same JSON. So here we have this example where we have an array, so a list of curves descriptions based on points. So we have here our base array, which is the curves array, which contains several curves descriptions. We have here 1, for example, and we have the next one here, and this contains the same that we saw before. So we have points, and then we have X, Z descriptions of our points. So if we parse our JSON and then access the curves array, then we can go deeper and go inside our points, inside each of these curves, and this will give us as result also a list of objects. So basically we go from the array, which contains a list of curves, which then contains a list of objects, which then contains objects with XZ coordinates. So as you can see, we are going deeper and deeper inside this JSON structure. So in this case, our points is going to give us a tree, which contains the different objects in our curve. So each branch represents each curve that is going to be created. So the branch 0, the branch 1, the branch 2. And then inside this, we have to access our coordinates. As we saw before, one way to access deeper information inside our JSON is to actually go directly to the address that we want. So for example, if we wanted the curve in the index number 2, so that means we will go curves, then number 2. Then we want to access the points inside this curve. So we will write the points access. And then we want to access inside these points the index number 1, for example. So we are going just to the first point, and then inside this number 1 we want to access the coordinate Z. So to sum up, we are going inside the curve index number 2. So that means we have here 0, 1, and 2. Then we're going to the point number 1. So that means the 0, 1. So this one that contains 200 and 200. And then we're just going exactly to the Z coordinate. So that should give us as result 200 units. So if we input this into our access JSON component, then we should get as result 200. So we want to do this same process but with all of our points. So we want to get this same address but for each of our curves and each of our points. So in this case we are building our addresses using this component, which is the concatenate component. And here again we are trying to create this same address. So we start with curves, we open the bracket, then we count how many curves we have. So we use this pufferfish component called list indexes, and this simply gives us the list of the indexes that we have. So we have 0, 1, and 2, so 3 curves. Then we access the points, so we're going in the second level, and then inside these points we want to access each of them. So that's why we have here our points as a tree, and then we access again the different indexes in our points. I could add another point inside my last curve, for example. So I could just copy this part, paste here, and then we are adding an additional point in our final curve. So let's say that this is gonna be 300 by 300. And then we're gonna get here then in our last one an additional index, and then with that we get as result all the addresses, the specific addresses of each of our curves and each of our points. So we go curve 0.0, curve 0.1, curve 0.2, etc. And then we also add the XZ coordinate. So we get 0.0, 0.0x, 0.0, 0.0z, and then all the way down until curve 2.4x. So basically using this concatenate component, which is a Grasshopper native component, we can create the exact address that we want to access inside our JSON structure, especially the more complex ones. And then with that is that we actually can access all of that. So we get this into a single list, and then we can take our original JSON, so the mother JSON, let's call it, and then with that we can access each of our data structures, and we get all of these numbers, which then we can convert into points. In this case we are using the numbers to points component, and this will give us a result, the different points inside our JSON. Now an additional attribute that we have in this JSON is called the position attribute. This is the attribute that we're gonna use for the Y coordinate. So as you can see, we have just X, Z here, but we also want to give it a depth, so a Y coordinate. So that's why we have here, we go inside our curves and then we go inside our position, because this is just in the second level, so we're gonna have to go deeper inside our JSON. Then we don't need to do the same that we did with the coordinates, which are in a deeper part of our JSON. And then with that we get all of the Y coordinates of our curves. So we have 0, 200, and 400. We convert that into our Y vector, and then we do a simple vector sum up to get our final points, and then we finally get our curves. So now what we can do with this? I mean, we can do with this whatever you would do with a regular Grasshopper definition. So for example, I could create a loft along our curves. So we just flatten here and we create a loft, and then with this we can do whatever we need to do in terms of our definition. For example, we could connect this loft inside this component that is a mesh VWrap component. Then we just use some custom settings so that we get a grid in our mesh. I use Weaverbird here to convert this mesh into a picture frame, and then I make this mesh a solid, and I give it a little bit of smoothness with this cut mule component, and then we get a more interesting shape for our definition. So now the idea is that we can actually then start playing with our JSON and get different results in our JSON. So if we were to move for example, one of the points in the middle curve down. So in the Z direction, we could move this one 100 down, so we can see how our shape starts to change, because basically we are just moving our coordinates. And this means that our data structure is now very flexible, because now we cannot just change our numbers, our data, our values inside the JSON, but we can also start pushing, so sending more information to our definition by adding more objects inside our list. So for example, we could start adding more points like we did before with our last object, that then get reflected in our definition. An alternative, for example, would be to use sliders. So you use a set of sliders which define the X, Y, and Z positions. But the problem of that is that then that is not scalable, because that means that every single time that you want to add an additional coordinate, an additional point, you need to add again 3 sliders, something that you can do just if you have access to the Grasshopper definition. But remember that we want to use this for an online configurator, which means that the final user doesn't have access to Grasshopper, but they have access to the data structure of your Grasshopper definition. And if your data structure is a JSON file, then they have a lot of flexibility to play with your definition. Of course, in this case, everything is just text, but the ideal situation would be that the final user doesn't see the actual JSON structure, but sees a user-friendly interface. So for example, in our webinar, we created this refs table, and in this case, we have these 3 points that you can move around, you can drag and drop, and then our table shape updates based on those coordinates. These points, these control points, are linked to a JSON structure, so that we can send all kind of information to this structure. We could add, for example, more control points in our viewer, so we could add other point here, so there is complete flexibility to create the shape of this table. Now you may wonder, how do I send this JSON to my online application? In this case, how do I send this JSON to ShapeDiver? We will answer this in our next episode, where we will continue talking about our JSON Objects topic. So if you don't want to miss out this second part, don't forget to subscribe. And if you learned something new today, please click on the like button down below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.